Hello, my fellow lords and ladies, and welcome to the Console Kingdom podcast. My name is Jared, and on today's episode, we are diving headfirst right into part 2 of our Final Fantasy retrospective. Final Fantasy VII through 9, this is going to be a good one, a really good one. There is so much to cover here. Final Fantasy VII through 9 is probably some of the most beloved Final Fantasy games of all time. Perhaps, sort of, kind of, maybe. Just kidding. Anyway, they are, absolutely. Anyway, so without further ado, here we go. Dan, I wanted to talk a little bit about a conversation we had briefly in our last episode. And I wanted to bring up Final Fantasy VI and one of my favorite all-time gold standard RPGs, Chrono Trigger. And Chrono Trigger is one of my favorite games of all time. And I kind of wanted to discuss, because you had brought up, Dan, how much you think Final Fantasy VI is a better game than Chrono Trigger.
It is.
And I wanted to kind of hear your thoughts on why you think it is.
I don't think it is. I know it is. It's a better game for a lot of reasons. I mean, the last time I tried to play Chrono Trigger, I couldn't even get into it. I couldn't even get into it. It was boring. It was tedious.
But why? Boring and tedious.
Yeah.
I mean, come on. You've got so many different side quests. You start out at a Millennial Fair. I mean, it's time travel. The characters are lovable. Not a few, but the characters are lovable, and it's got everything you could ever want from a game. Now, Final Fantasy VI has plenty of characters and great story, and I would argue a much better final boss than Lavos was. But I just didn't quite get the emotional feels as I did with Chrono Trigger.
Final Fantasy VI has way more emotional feels than Chrono Trigger. Chrono Trigger has a silent protagonist who is like basically a self-insertion character. He is Pants. We have Chrono Pants. You put on your Chrono Pants, and then you sort of experience the world through him. He's not a character. He doesn't exist. He's just sprites. Like, he doesn't have a personality. There's nothing to get attached to. There's nothing to sympathize or empathize with. He's a blank slate character. And the rest of the characters are just kind of obnoxious.
You could say that about Chrono being silent, but might I argue about that is in The Legend of Zelda, we have had Link as the protagonist for almost every single game in the series, and he has never once spoken a single line of dialogue. It has always been text, and people love Link as a character.
Sure, but now we're talking about two completely different styles of storytelling. The Legend of Zelda tells its stories through its world. It tells its stories through the extensive lore. It doesn't tell its story through the actions and speech of its protagonist or supporting characters. In the later games, a little bit more, but especially if we go back in the beginning, there was no character interaction between Link and the other characters in the game world, and if there was, it was extremely minimal. The storytelling was done by other methods, whereas in a game like Final Fantasy VI or Chrono Trigger, they both fall under that umbrella of Square RPGs, where the storytelling element of the game is very, very tightly based on the interactions of the characters. And having a protagonist that doesn't interact, it really mitigates by a lot how much emotional connection you can possibly have to that character and that world.
And I get that. I can get that. And I definitely will say that I will give the edge to character development and extrapolation upon those lines to Final Fantasy VI. But I don't know. I can't put my finger on it. But for me, there's always been something about Chrono Trigger that has just been dear to my heart. I don't know if it's the techniques, like the techs, that your characters can do, The magic system, which I thought was incredibly unique. Antipode is such a fun spell. Luminaire, I mean, nuke the whole screen, why don't you? There's just so much about that game, and then the side quests are just fantastic. I feel like they're with Final Fantasy VI. The second half of the game is a lot of, you can do this to learn more about the characters, or you can ignore it. It's up to you, basically. Kind of the same, but the story in Chrono Trigger drives you more to the characters' endings and whatnot through its level design and whatnot, and areas and time periods and stuff like that. I don't know. I mean, it's always been a tough decision for myself personally, because you've got kind of 50-50. I mean, it's really hard, but I still got to give that edge to Chrono Trigger.
It's a very beloved game. A lot of people really love it. I played through it once, when it came out when I was a kid. I think I played through it one more time, many years later on an emulator. But I don't think I finished it that second time because I got bored. Just got bored.
And that's a valid reason. I mean, if it doesn't grip you, if it doesn't bring you into the world, it doesn't draw you in, I feel like then it makes sense to not finish, if it doesn't grab your attention. I mean, it's like, okay, I'll play it through and the first time and then the second time. But see, the New Game Plus aspect of it and the multiple different endings, I think, is a very, very unique thing that Square did there. And that definitely bears mention because...
Yeah, it was novel honestly, at the time.
It was novel at the time. But what other game series or what other game during that time had 16 different endings, and you could New Game Plus and keep all your stuff aside from story items?
Yeah, I mean, New Game Plus was cool, but again, if I'm not enjoying the game, then New Game Plus is kind of meaningless for me.
And that makes sense. I would say that. Now, that being said, what I would like is for our listeners to hop on our socials, either on Twitter or Facebook. We'll drop those at the end of the show. You can contact us and connect with us there and let us know, what do you guys think? What do you feel is the better game, Final Fantasy VI?
They're going to tear me apart.
Or Chrono Trigger? And you know what? Sometimes that's the way it goes, but I have a sneaking suspicion that there's more people on your side than you think.
Oh, man. Honestly. I'm going to get beat up over this one.
I'm not so sure about that.
Well, if I'm going to get beat up anyway, I'm going to make one more statement. Final Fantasy VI is the best game on the Super Nintendo.
Now, see, that is definitely in the conversation. It is on the conversation. Actually, I would kind of tend to agree with you there, as Final Fantasy VI definitely felt like it was optimized better than Chrono Trigger was for the Super Nintendo.
In addition to that, the Super Nintendo is also the best console of all time.
Oh, obviously, it really is. And just shout out to a few people that love the Nintendo 64. You're wrong. 100% wrong.
Oh, I mean, that's a whole other topic. The Nintendo 64, man, I hate that thing. Just the controller's awful. There's like maybe a dozen good games for it. It's trash.
I feel like we'd have to be hanging out in Chernobyl for a while to be able to play Nintendo 64 properly, because we'd have to grow a third hand.
You're right. Yeah, third hand, absolutely. You need a third hand, and gotta lose some brain cells.
Definitely. So before we get too sidetracked here,
You're right.
I want to get into our main topic of conversation. Oh man, this one's going to be special. Final Fantasy on the PlayStation. And what better place to start than the legacy and the just how much changed when Sony and Square met and developed their games on a compact disc versus a cartridge. And I know that's a couple topics right there, obviously, but I wanted to start with just how special it felt when you put the disc in and you heard the music, you saw the intros, and you realized, wait a minute, this is a whole new era for the series. I mean,
It was a magical experience.
It truly was. I mean, as much as I loved how the intro to Final Fantasy VI was, it just they one upped themselves, right? I mean, in 7, 8, and 9, they really one upped themselves
Yeah.
moving forward in that time period. Now, Dan, I wanted to ask you. This is when you played Final Fantasy VII for the first time, when you popped it in your PlayStation for the first time. About what era, like what year around the time did you play that?
So, well, my first experience with Final Fantasy VII was secondhand because
Okay.
it was all the rage. It was a huge buzz around this game. Now, we discussed before, I'd been playing Final Fantasy since the first one on the NES. So for me, I was already a huge fan of the series, but to a lot of other, people, it was new. It was something they'd never experienced before. Now, I think the first time I was exposed to the game, the first time I saw it, was at my friend Annie's house. So this game came
Okay.
out. This game came out in
97.
1997 at the very beginning, January 31st of 1997. So this game came out
Okay.
when I was 16, and I remember first seeing it at my friend Annie's house. Her brother was playing, and seeing the introduction was something I didn't experience until a little bit later. So I first saw like a little bit of after leaving Midgar. I think the first thing I really saw was Calm and the Midgar Zolom, some of the earlier summons.
Okay. Okay. Um, when
But it did blow me away absolutely at the time because we'd never seen this before. These multiple camera angles and these 3D summon monsters that come through. The graphical improvements alone were astonishing.
Most definitely. And, when I first played it, I'm going to self admit this as well. I did not, I wasn't aware of Final Fantasy VII or the legacy of it, or like just how
Mm.
popular it was um, until probably the year 2003. I
Really?
was a I was a junior in high school, and my buddy was like, "Have you played Final Fantasy VII?" I said, "No, I had Final Fantasy VIII. I bought Final Fantasy VIII. Um, it was me getting back into the series at the time because I was at a KB Toys, of all places, and they had a bargain bin there, and I think I picked up Final Fantasy VIII for like
Okay.
$10,
All right.
and so that was my reintroduction to the series. And my buddy asked me, he said, "Hey, have you played Final Fantasy VII yet?" And I said, "No, no, I only played Final Fantasy VIII." And he goes, "Oh man, you have no idea what you're missing. Here, borrow this game.
Yeah.
Just borrow this game. Play this." And I have a funny story about that I'll bring up later when we get closer into that conversation. But yeah, so it was 2003. So I mean, that's
Yeah.
6 years after it was released,
Hmm.
and I was blind. Like, I
Wow.
knew
So you weren't
nothing.
there for like the initial impact of how huge this game was.
No, and well, I mean, I was alive, but I wasn't aware of that whole craze at the time.
It's incredibly difficult, and for the younger crowd especially, to really put into terms that you can understand just how huge this game was. This game was a massive runaway hit, and it changed absolutely everything about not just RPGs, but about video games as a medium at the time. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that this was a game changer in just about every way. Now, we were talking before about the N64 and how much that thing stinks. I mean, do you know, Jared, how this happened? That instead of developing these games exclusively for Nintendo, they started developing them for Sony instead?
I'm not sure how that happened, but one thing I do know for sure was that Sony and Nintendo had a deal going on with a potential add-on disc system add-on to the Super Nintendo or its Nintendo's next console. I can't remember which one what it was, but it ended up falling through, and Sony, having the technology already developed, just kind of finished developing the rest of it and introduced PlayStation. Now, as far as how Square came to be hand in hand with Sony and not Nintendo, I'm not very aware of how that happened.
Well, the way I understand it is that the Nintendo 64 was, for one thing, incredibly expensive to develop for. The developers would have to purchase a dev kit that used this like SGI Silicon Graphics CPU. It was insanely expensive, much more expensive than any other development hardware had been up to that point.
Okay,
On
okay.
top of that, Nintendo had for a long time had business practices when it comes to their third parties that were really, really difficult to make money with and kind of like had a stranglehold on them. So Nintendo had a lot of control over what they did, and like they had to buy their cartridge shells from Nintendo
Okay.
at whatever price Nintendo asked them to pay. So they had very little say in the matter in terms of their own manufacturing. Basically, Nintendo got the lion's share of all the profits for the third party titles, and there really hadn't been an alternative up to that point that offered anything that Nintendo's console didn't offer. Like, yeah, you could develop for the Genesis instead of the Super Nintendo, but the result of that was going to be you're going to sell many fewer games than you otherwise would have. And the Genesis hardware was not as powerful as the Super Nintendo hardware in many ways, so you would have to make some compromises and sacrifices there. So Nintendo was the preferred platform for the third-party publishers pretty much through the 80s and 90s, at least in the US. Other parts of the world it was a little bit different. Also in Japan as well for the most part, but then there was the PC Engine, that's a whole other story. But that's basically more or less the way it was. When Sony released the PlayStation, they had cheaper development kits. It was much cheaper to buy the media, the CD media, and you could buy it from a third party. You didn't have to buy it directly from Sony because they had a third party that actually took care of all that for them. And they made much better deals with the third party publishers that they got to keep more of their money. So Square was by far not alone in this decision. A lot of third party developers started developing their games for Sony rather than Nintendo, or they would develop for Nintendo later after they already made money with Sony. But
And that makes sense business wise because
yeah,
you think about it, you're talking about a company that says, develop for us, but we get the profits. Well,
right,
that doesn't make sense.
right. And one of the many reasons why a lot of these up and coming games wound up going to the PlayStation also was because you could do things with CD-ROM media that you just couldn't do on a cartridge. And that's not to say that the cartridge media itself was totally bad or that the Nintendo 64 wasn't a powerful system, because it was. The Nintendo 64 did some things very well. As much as I think overall the system is trash, it did do some things very, very well. Those cartridges did not have a lot of storage, but the system itself had a much faster processor, had more system memory in the system itself, so it could do a lot more things that with the 3D graphics where things look cleaner, things look nicer, things look sharper. And if you look at two games on the N64 and on the PlayStation, put them side by side, 10 times out of 10, the N64 version rather looks better than the PlayStation version. But, well, I shouldn't say but yet, because one other really good thing about cartridges was cartridges are basically just flash memory. It's like sticking a USB drive into a computer.
Okay.
There's no load times.
Well, yeah, that's true. There is no load times with cartridges, but that, you know what? I didn't realize that it was like flash memory. Interesting.
Yeah. Basically, all you're doing when you plug a cartridge into a system that takes cartridges is you're literally plugging a memory module with a game on it into an expansion port. The cartridges are read-only memory. They're basically like a memory stick in a computer.
Nice. That's interesting.
Yeah. But they can't be written to. They can be read from. So yeah, kind of cool thing there. Now, without getting too into the dry kind of technical stuff, though, right? I want to just wrap that up real quick, because with CDs, you could do something you couldn't do with the cartridges because of that additional storage space, and that was you could add CD quality audio, and you could add, which they didn't even do here, by the way. Final Fantasy VII's audio is all MIDI because they didn't know that they could put CD audio onto this thing. But you could also have full motion video, which for a living room console was a brand new concept. Like, this had been around for a little while with like desktop PCs that had CD-ROMs, because CD-ROMs had been around since like the early 90s, and there was like Wing Commander and stuff like that. And of course there was even like the Sega CD, but that thing didn't hardly have any games. But now a full system that was completely CD based, that was powerful, had 3D graphics, was doing things that we had never seen in the living room before up to that point.
And what's cool about that too is we discussed this, is that, you know, with FMV and full motion video and that kind of stuff, just the different camera angles that Final Fantasy introduced. And when you think about this as a whole, right, you think about it and think about the game that you've been playing, your most recent game that you have, and you see these different angles and cutscenes and like beautiful graphics, right? But this was, if you take yourself back, this was really unheard of at the time. It was cutting edge, and we're talking about blocks. You know, we're talking about polygons, not pixels. And it was it's just one of those things that still to this day has changed the entire face of an industry.
We've never had games telling us stories like that before, at least not in the living room. Like there were definitely full motion video in games prior to that on DOS, but those were mostly, you know, like pre-recorded, very low res movies. You know, like Wing Commander had some. That's the best example I could think of that had little movies that played. But now this entire game was made in such a way, you had different camera angles, you had different animation for the characters on screen, and you could, for the first time, see a cinematic approach to creating a video game, and a more Hollywood approach to telling a story. So we're not just telling the story anymore just in text, like we used to. But now we have so many more ways to communicate with the player. And camera angles, movement, the music can change, the lighting can change. The sort of way that a director would change things in a feature film to evoke the same kind of emotional response from the audience.
And that's the beauty of it too. I mean, just think of how, trying to gather my thoughts here. Think of how Uematsu made that entire soundtrack MIDI, but was still able to have impactful scenes and music that tugged at your heartstrings.
And look, I mean, that soundtrack still slaps harder than Will Smith at the Oscars. I mean, it doesn't matter, it's MIDI. It's still fantastic.
Absolutely. It was one of the only, actually, fun fact about me, it was one of the only video game soundtracks that I owned on compact disc. I had the entire soundtrack on CD. I think it was like 4 different discs. and it was the entire MIDI at track 1 through the very end. And that was fun. That was really cool. I enjoyed that a lot.
That's cool. So I mean, the music of Final Fantasy is by itself, a massive discussion because it's all so tremendous, and I still listen to Distant Worlds all the time. Now, I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about something we talked about before, how this game came to be. One thing that I wanted to touch on was, did you know, Jared, that this was planned to be a Super Nintendo game, like way back at the beginning of its development?
That was something I have never heard before.
And I think they wanted to utilize the CD-ROM add-on for it.
Okay, so then that makes sense.
Now, also, here's another fun fact. I'm going to throw a little more trivia out there. Xenogears, what would eventually become Xenogears, began as an early concept for Final Fantasy VII.
Interesting.
But it was too dark. It was too dark, they said.
Yeah.
I thought that was kind of a cool little factoid.
Yeah, and
go ahead. Tell me your thought. Don't let me hijack the whole thing. I'll hijack the whole conversation if you let me.
I was just gonna say, I think a lot about back in those days, back in the 90s and stuff, and just how media came across, and it, right during those times, we had just gotten introduced to dial-up internet. We got introduced to a lot just newer technology. Things kept getting better and better, and Sony introduces a PlayStation right during that time period. And I have to wonder if maybe if Sony would have waited to release, right? If Sony would have waited for the tech to get a little bit better, would they be where they are today? Now, that's an entirely different conversation altogether, but it's just a thought that I had because, the 90s was just one of those weird times where it didn't want to be the 80s, but it wasn't the 2000s either. It was just kind of awkward. Kind of think
it was a time of
teenagers,
Yeah, it was a time of rapid technological growth. Things were changing very, very fast. We were coming into the internet age for the first time. Home computers had just really begun to become a common thing within the last couple of years before the game came out. Dial-up internet, broadband internet was not even a thing yet. So to put this in perspective, especially for the younger crowd, when this game came out, you couldn't just go on the internet and go look up information about it.
No.
Maybe if you were at the library or at school, maybe you could, but if you were at home, it would take forever. You would have to sit there in front of your computer for 10, 15 minutes just to look at a picture.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like it is today where we know everything about a game just by going on the internet and checking it out. So when we experienced this game for the first time, and like you were saying, experienced that beautiful, chilling, haunting introductory sequence with the green orbs floating around, and then you see the camera zoom, and there's Aerith, and she's by the broken pipe, and then the camera pans out. She's walking toward the camera. The camera pans out to the center of Midgar, and now you're seeing the Loveless poster. You're hearing and seeing the train coming by. You're seeing all the people walking around and moving, and this was absolute magic at the time. Nothing like that had ever been in a video game, for most of us at least. I don't think anything like that had been in a video game up to that point.
No, not anywhere close to that. Not anywhere close. And it's really interesting, how that kind of went. And what I wanted to you brought up Aerith. I wanted to bring up the characters of Final Fantasy VII real quickly because, they had personalities, right? They were they had way more personality than, say, Final Fantasy VI. Now, yes, Final Fantasy VI is still one of the best games ever, but Cloud, Tifa, Barrett, even Biggs, Wedge, Jesse, these characters, they all had a personality, and I struggle to find a game previous to this, to Final Fantasy VII, that actually had that kind of feeling of each character having an individual personality.
Yeah, not only could we now learn about these characters from what they were saying with the on-screen text, and obviously the limitation of the on-screen text is virtually the sky, right? At this point, we've got 700 megabytes to work with rather than 8. No, not even, like 2. Yeah. The last generation, you had about 2 megabytes to work with. Now you got about 700. And plus, it's 3 discs. So that's like 2 gigs. You have like about 2 gigs to work with at this point. So text, forget about it. You could put an entire encyclopedia onto these discs. No problem. So there are no limitations. There's nothing stopping them from telling a story in text. But now you have so much more technology that you can tell a story through the way that people move, the way they interact, the way that the camera pans out and zooms in. And you can get to know the characters on a much more intimate level. Now, on top of that, these character designs are iconic, and we all know that. And of course, we have Tetsuya Nomura to thank for that, who is now, I think, probably one of the most important people at Square Enix, and has become a director. He's the mind behind Kingdom Hearts. He's the person that made the game that Final Fantasy XV should have been. You've also got, of course, you've also got now, because we're talking about the writing and the way the characters are developed that way, you've got Nojima now, writing, and of course Kitase directing, and this is kind of a dream team that creates this world and these characters for us. And in terms of the character designs, the character designs are iconic. I mean,
I was going to say.
I think Cloud and Sephiroth are pretty much synonymous with Final Fantasy at this point.
Oh, yes. I was going to say the 90s kind of was the Dream Team era. I mean, you had the literal Dream Team, and then you had a lot more Dream Teams as well. But before, one of the things I had brought up earlier, and I'll tell you this story now. So, after I had gotten the game and I was working my way through Midgar and that kind of stuff, my buddy was like, well, prepare for sadness. And I'm like, what's Final Fantasy? I mean, yeah, I get it, sadness. But see, this is where it gets interesting, because he had me absolutely 100% convinced that it was Tifa and not Aerith.
Really? That's amazing.
And when it happened, when that moment happened, I absolutely lost it, and I cried for the first time in a video game ever.
It was a truly breathtaking moment. Truly breathtaking moment.
It really was, and that was something big. That was huge. I mean, can you imagine playing games your entire life up to that point and getting such a scene and watching as Sephiroth descends from the heavens and stabs Aerith right through the chest, and the materia falls, and as soon as it hits the floor, that music comes in, and it's just raw, powerful emotion. And it affected you. And to this day, it affects you. Every time you see it, you know it's coming, and it still affects you.
I remember this game, experiencing this scene at my friend Steve's house, because basically I first saw my friend Annie's house, and I didn't get the game until Christmas because I asked for it. But I watched my friend Steve play pretty much the entire game, pretty much from start to finish. And so I remember this at his house, sitting in his basement, just the jaw dropping, because she's dead. She's not temporarily incapacitated. You don't find her in a cave later. She's dead. She died. She's gone. And not only did Cloud fail in his mission to protect her, the one thing she asked him to do, but you feel like you must have done something wrong. Where did I go wrong? Can I save her? Can I stop this from happening? Do I have to go reload my old save? Where did I mess up? And there's some attachment, and there's definitely some attachment to the character that I'm speechless thinking about it, because the whole experience with Aerith, right? Because Cloud obviously is meant to be the protagonist. You're supposed to kind of, experience the game through him. And he's very stoic. He's very difficult to read. He starts sort of opening up a little bit because of her. And she's fun, and she's quirky, and, she's incredibly positive and optimistic. And it's really hard not to get attached to this character. And they did an incredible, tremendous job in making Aerith a lovable character that you get attached to. And then you lose her, and it's like a stab through your own heart. It's a heartbreaking moment.
Absolutely. It's a gut punch like no other. And really, that moment really set the table. Because you have to think, what is the very next thing that happens, right? You fight Genova. And if most people were like me, you were bawling your eyes out and you were pissed. Man, did you feel like you were the one slashing Genova. You were the one shooting Genova, or whatever character you had. You felt like you were the one striking, slashing, punching, shooting, whatever it may be. And then it just kind of moves on and the story continues, and you're forced. And this is where I love how they did this, because after they lay her to rest and she sinks to the bottom, you're forced to continue on. You feel what Cloud is feeling. That should I continue? Should I not continue? And you feel that like drive. And how many video games have captured that feeling in your lifetime? I can't think of many off the top of my head. Not many.
I've seen a few movies that really emotionally impacted me. When you get attached to a character and invested in them and they die. I mean, obviously there are other things that'll happen too, but it's the death of a beloved character is always, if it's done well, is always a very emotional moment. And I had never seen that in a video game up until this point.
Exactly. And just absolute, oh man, that was something. And honestly, I think that was probably the biggest moment in the 3 PlayStation games that they released. I can't think of a moment in 8 that did it. I can't think of a moment. I can't think of a moment in 9 that did it.
Yeah.
It just,
nothing was going to top that.
Yeah, it was one of those things. And just think about how angry you were at Sephiroth and how satisfying it was to finally hear that wonderful musical piece, One Winged Angel, and it is time. It is time to finish this.
Yeah, it's incredible build-up. And that's one of the elements you need to tell a good story. You need to have a build-up. Every story has to have, you have your protagonist, you have your antagonist, and you have your conflict. And the conflict is what drives the narrative. So in this case, we have the conflict between Cloud and Sephiroth. We have that amazing climax of, seeing him kill Aerith, and it makes the player want to see Sephiroth get taken down. And not only do you get to see him get taken down, but you get to be the one to do it.
Yeah. And, going from Final Fantasy VII and moving into Final Fantasy VIII, it had a big name to live up to.
Yeah.
And you and I have a very unpopular opinion, is that Final Fantasy VIII is a good game.
I think it's an excellent game. I think Final Fantasy VIII is wonderful.
I enjoy it a lot.
I
It's
think
one of my
I'll,
top five.
go ahead.
Definitely top. I was going to say one of my top five in the series,
Yeah,
all together. Definitely, it's in that conversation. Maybe
I feel
even
like
top three.
I feel like a lot of people disliked 8 just because it was so different from 7. I mean, 7 is still the most successful game ever in the Final Fantasy franchise. It's sold over 12 million units. Of course, there's some people like me who have purchased it several times on multiple platforms, but still 12 million units is definitely a massively successful game. Uh,
Yeah, and that's why it's been getting the remake treatment, and it's getting all
mhm.
this, Advent Children, all these spin-off games such as oh, now I can't think of the name of it.
Dirge of Cerberus
Dirge of
and
Cerberus.
what's
The
that one
one
that I
with
don't like but that you really like?
Yeah, the one with Zach. That's the one I'm trying to
The Zach
remember.
one.
Um,
That's so weird. I'm drawing a blank on it too.
anyway,
That's
that game,
ridiculous. That's ridiculous. I can't believe I can't remember the name of the game right now.
it's escaping me, but they've had all these spin-offs,
Yeah.
and that's how successful Final Fantasy VII was.
I never liked all that. I never liked the whole universe of Final Fantasy VII thing. I feel like the
And
story that needed to be told had already been told.
Advent Children, I enjoyed a lot. Advent Children Complete, I really, really enjoyed that.
All right. Our Children was kind of cool. It was pretty cool. It's definitely trying to watch it now though. Like it was corny. It was pretty corny.
It
It was
kind of
good.
was. The one disappointment I had was how they handled Omni Slash. I did not enjoy that. It really didn't come across as Omni Slash to me.
It was also kind of crazy how they gave Cloud like a motorcycle and a sword that like splits into 75 different swords and like it's never explained like how he gets any of this stuff. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. I
It's been a
mean,
long time. I could be remembering things. I last watched this movie probably about 10 years ago, so I probably am remembering some stuff wrong. But you get the idea.
yeah. He would have been better off. They would have been better off giving him the crystal Ultima weapon. But
Yeah.
regardless of
So
that,
yeah, Final Fantasy VIII is great. And if you don't think so, it's because you're an uncultured plebeian,
the thing about Final Fantasy VIII, and
repugnant basement dweller.
this is the biggest things that I hear about the game. It's the junction system. I
Right.
don't understand the
Get out of
magic
here.
system. It's such a grind. And then the monsters level up when you level up, so it's supposed to be a low level run. How am I supposed to get AP for my junctions or for my GFs to learn the abilities that I need without over leveling myself? Listen, it was a different system, yes. If the junction system probably took me a good while to figure out, but once I finally had it figured out, I know I could break the game within the first 5 hours of gameplay.
I mean, the game being super breakable probably isn't a good selling point. I mean, let's be honest, all the Final Fantasy games are very breakable because they're all kind of broken, and there's always kind of little things that I think they release these games and they just hope that no one figures out. But of course, it's been long enough that it's all been figured out. But the monsters level up with you, like that's a criticism. That's like most games, like most RPGs that are not Final Fantasy do that. Like a lot of games have done that for a very long time. The whole point of that is so that you don't just grind yourself to overlevel. That's the whole reason for that. So you can't just do what you could do in every other Final Fantasy game up to that point and walk around in a circle and grind levels forever and out level all the content.
Yeah, and it I liked that as a thing, and we're missing something very very important that I wanted to bring up here, um, and that is the mini games aspect of Final Fantasy, especially in Gold Saucer, Triple
Mm-hmm.
Triad. In 9, they had cards, jump rope, races, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. I mean,
Um,
7 was amazing for the mini games because of Final Fantasy VII, every single JRPG on the PlayStation like had to have mini games. They would shoehorn them into everything. Like, and there were so many. Like in Legend of Legaia, there was that like lousy dancing game, and there was like the dumb pig race game in Legend of Dragoon. They would like shoehorn them in there because after Final Fantasy VII, you had to have mini games because they were all so fun. The motorcycle game was so much fun.
Submarine.
The submarine game was a lot of fun.
The
It
Mog.
was very enjoyable. Yeah, the
Mog
Mog House
mission.
wasn't that fun. That wasn't that fun.
But
and they had the little dopey fighting game in there.
It was worth though doing the Mog game because you got a decent amount of GP, and
Yes.
And real talk. I'm going to be straight up here. I did not realize how easy it was to get GP in Gold Saucer by Chocobo racing. And the thing of it was before I knew that, I would grind out hundreds of GP by just playing the same games over and over and over again just to get GP. And I'm like, there's something I'm missing here. And then I started working on the Chocobo side quest to get the gold Chocobo and the legendary Knights of the Round, and realized, hey, why didn't I think of this before?
Did you know that if you don't use Knights of the Round against the final form of Genova, that Sephiroth becomes easier?
Interesting. I just usually use my highest level magic spells and my limit breaks for that fight against Genova Death or whatever it was. I can't remember which.
If you use Knights of the Round, Sephiroth gets like something like an extra 100,000 hit points or something like that.
I mean, it makes sense. They had to. They probably didn't want you to cheese the boss, the final boss. I mean, you basically get Knights of the Round just to survive against Ruby and Emerald. So they had to probably have a modifier in there just in case, so you wouldn't cheese the final boss.
Which is another reason why not being able to overlevel the content in 8 was, in my opinion, a good thing.
And it really was. And what was nice about that too is for your higher level magic to junction, the higher the level of the monster, the easier it was to draw rarer spells. That's why it was so nice to have Cactar in that game, because he came with level, or was it Tonberry? It was either Cactar or Tonberry where you could level up. I think it was Tonberry. You could level up the enemies, or you could level them down.
Mm-hmm. There's always so many cool little tricks like that in these games, and 8 had probably the most. I mean, they always make these systems, like the junction system, they always make this stuff to be like way more complicated than it actually is. It's really not that complicated. You just, whatever stat you want your person to have the highest one of, you junction whichever spell gives you the highest number. It's not that difficult. It's not that tricky. And then just, don't have that character cast that spell. It's not complicated like at all. It's really not.
It's not. And
then you get it's tedious to draw spells. Last time I played through this game was a couple of years ago, and I didn't find it tedious at all to draw spells. In fact, I had like full stock of spells to where like I had to burn spells to like get rid of them so I could make room for more spells.
Yeah, exactly. And that's another thing about the minigame in Final Fantasy VIII Triple Triad, which in my opinion is the best minigame Final Fantasy has ever had.
Yeah.
It's so much fun to play.
Excellent.
It is so much fun to learn. It is a pain in the butt to get the rules the way you want them because of the RNG, but if you can manage to do that, your success, man, you can card mod things and become super, super strong where you don't even have to think about a boss until the final dungeon. Really.
Yeah, people like do min-max runs all the time where they complete the game at level 1.
Yeah.
Oh, by the way, last time I played it on an emulator, and I cheated the card game massively. I played on an emulator, and I would just like, if I lost a card that I didn't want to lose, I would just reload the save state.
Reload the state. Yeah.
I was save state cheesing last time I played, but I mean, it's a game I played 100 times, and I was just playing for fun, so whatever.
Well, in the remastered edition on Xbox, and I think that's available on PlayStation as well as Steam. The remastered edition, you can exit the game and reload your save. So you obviously, in your case, you'd be right by the character that you were playing against. But if you found a save point before you played a game and you lost, all you had to do was go into the menu and hit exit. It would take you right back to the title screen, and then you could just reload your save. So that's how I ended up getting a Dea's card, because that's probably, in my opinion, one of the hardest rare cards to get in the game.
Okay, why is that remaster not in widescreen? Like, what is up with that?
Yeah.
Why is it not widescreen? That makes no sense to me.
No, and the thing is if they wouldn't have, they didn't widescreen it, so why don't they put like a selectable background along the sides?
Put a bezel. Because I can play that on RetroArch right now, and I can make it widescreen, or I can put a bezel around it. And that's free.
Right.
I have the game. I have the game. I'm not stealing it. So I mean, and then I play it in RetroArch. Like, why? So why is the version that you have to buy digitally for what do they want? $30 for that, and you don't even have anything to fill in the black. Stupid. It's stupid.
Yeah, it was one of those things that I didn't appreciate about it, but again, it wasn't the end of the world for me with that.
I mean, look. At least when Renoa tells Squall he's the best-looking guy in the room, his face doesn't look like just a mess of pixels anymore.
Right.
I guess that's an improvement, right?
Yeah.
That's something that I always thought was kind of funny. Like, that game, they went kind of the opposite direction in that one, right? Because in 7, you had these kind of chibi characters that looked like Legos, basically.
Yeah. Yep.
But then in 8, they had these kind of like very, I don't say very human looking, but much more human looking character models. Yeah. And the way they played with the production of the game, it had a very weird feel, I thought, especially in the beginning. Because, like, you talked before about, like, camera angles and stuff, but they did weird stuff here where, like, the camera angle would change during a story sequence. Like, in the beginning when you're talking to Quistis in the hallway, Squall and Quistis in the hallway, but, like, they're walking toward the camera and having a conversation, and you actually are controlling Squall while that's happening. It's a very weird feel. That might have been one thing that kind of threw people off in the beginning too.
Yeah, and very possible. But let's talk about something real quick. Here. Squall, as a character.
Let's talk about Squall.
Let's
talk about Eddie Furlong.
He is so misunderstood. Oh, he is so misunderstood.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you know that he's based on Edward Furlong, the actor who was in T2 Judgment Day? Did you know that? His character model was based on that.
Really, I did not.
Much more of Nomura's style showing in this one, by the way. So Squall, so misunderstood. What's the main thing you always hear people saying about Squall? You hear them saying, "Oh, I don't like Squall. He's so emo." He is like the exact opposite of emo. He's
to an extreme, really, because it's like he built a wall and then cemented it and then reinforced it with steel and then reinforced it with more steel and then put up another wall. And I mean, essentially,
he's very 90s.
He walled himself off from feeling anything at all. And if you're emo, you live and die on emotion.
Yes. He's the exact opposite of that. He's not whiny. He never whines in the game. All he ever really does is say, "I don't care." He complains a little about like adults are stupid and things like that. But you know who he reminds me of? The character he most reminds me of is Randall from Clerks. That's who Squall reminds me of.
Holy, you know what? I never thought of that.
Everything seems stupid to me.
Yeah.
That's the kind of character he is. He's very cynical. The whole game, really, is very cynical.
Yeah.
It's definitely taking this sort of view of the world and looking at things through the eyes of a teenager who has been through some stuff and had a lot of responsibility thrust upon him, and he's trying to deal with all of that.
It's a very jaded.
Yeah, exactly.
A very jaded worldview.
His whole character arc is based on him overcoming that sort of, like you said, walled off way of thinking about things. He's got a terrible case of imposter syndrome. And I think a lot of us can identify with that. If you don't know what imposter syndrome is, think about, have you ever been thinking how, oh my God, my partner is one day going to realize that I am nowhere near as good as they think I am and they're going to leave. Or my employer one day is going to realize I am not good at the job that they hired me to do and they're going to fire me. That's imposter syndrome. Like, I'm not actually good at things. I'm just tricking everyone into thinking I am. So that's what Squall is doing the whole game. Why do people keep giving me responsibility? I'm not a good leader. I'm not a good soldier. I'm not a good friend. And the whole character arc is him coming to terms with the fact that he's being given opportunities and he's being given the acceptance and love and friendship of other people, not because he somehow tricked them or because they're stupid, but because he is genuinely a capable person. And he doesn't give himself enough credit for what he actually is. And when the game ends, the final resolution of his character arc is he's finally allowed himself to accept his role.
Yeah, I would say it's still probably the strangest ending to a Final Fantasy game that I've ever experienced.
Well, I mean, the whole premise was kind of bizarre. Like, Ultimacia's ultimate plan was to compress time. That doesn't even make sense. Like, what does that even mean? Like, what time compression? Like, what even is that? And I guess maybe that's kind of part of it. Maybe you're supposed to sort of ponder, like, what is time compression? What happens if you take all of time and compress it into a single what then? Like, if you're compressing time, then, like, does a second really exist anymore? Is everything compressed into a single second? If all things are happening at all times, are there, like, just thousands of timelines, but they're all pushed into the same timeline? Is it like merging the multiverses? Like, what exactly is time compression? It's never explained. There's a little bit of wacky stuff at the end where I guess some elements of time begin blending into each other. And I don't know. I'm spinning my wheels because maybe it's not. Maybe it is something we're not supposed to be able to fathom or understand. It's supposed to be beyond the capacity of a human being to understand it, and that's why it's such a terrifying prospect. I don't know.
Yeah, it's one of those things that has always eluded me, but I never really took the time to stop and think about it. I every time I see the ending after I play the game, I'm just like, that's weird, and then move on.
So Squall's great, right? We talked about Squall. Squall's great. If you still don't like Squall, then I don't know what to tell you. Squall's great, and if you don't like him, you're wrong. But the rest of the cast is kind of meh.
I would agree.
I think one of the things that really kind of grinds my gears with this one is that there's some anime tropes in there, like every woman in the cast is like relentlessly throwing themselves at Squall the entire time, which is such like a shonen anime trope. Always like the protagonist, no matter what kind of guy he is, just constantly has women throwing themselves at him all the time. And that kind of devalues the characters as well. Like Quistis, who's supposed to be like an authority figure to him, is following him around with puppy dog eyes, and then Rinoa like barely exists outside of her relationships to the men in the story. Like, she's like an anti-feminist icon. She's Ophelia from Hamlet. She just has no existence, apart from how she relates to her father, to Cypher, to Squall. She has no identity. I have no idea who this woman is. Like, I can look at Final Fantasy VII, and I can say, okay, Aerith, she's fun, she's quirky, she's got a lot of emotional scars that she's covering up.
I was gonna say Tifa's got a great big pair of personality.
Well, Tifa is very Tifa is apart from basically being kind of the perfect woman in video game form. I mean, she's got dark hair, she's got long legs, she's got the rest of her. But she's also very vulnerable. She's very guarded. She is extremely caring and nurturing. And these are qualities that I can't identify any qualities in Rinoa. I can't identify any qualities in Quistis. In fact, that kind of brings me to like the Final Fantasy VII remake, because they expanded the character of Jessie, and her entire personality and the only quality she has is that she's horny. Literally the only thing about Jessie that stands out at all is that she's horny. She's nothing else. She's not smart. She's not brave. She's not compassionate. She's just horny. And that, I hate that. That bothers me.
Yeah.
And
that was...
Give these characters character. Develop them. Give us something.
Something. But, see, therein lies where it gets real fascinating. Because in Final Fantasy IX, they definitely gave the characters personalities, in my opinion.
Yes, and they gave us another beautiful dark-haired girl in Garnet. And Garnet, in my opinion, I think in Final Fantasy IX, and there's so much more to talk about here as well in Final Fantasy IX, that is a wonderful game. It is, or at least was at one point, Sakaguchi's favorite Final Fantasy game. And this one, Final Fantasy IX, directed by Hiroyuki Ito, the first time we see Hiroyuki Ito being the director of a Final Fantasy title. But I think, really, that Garnet is much more of a protagonist in the story than Zidane is. And the kind of game that it is, being, a JRPG, I know that, like, you always want to go for the young man protagonist, because it's really very deeply rooted in the same kind of storytelling as shonen anime was. And I'm going to come back to that shonen anime point, because that's just what things were like at the time. All of these Japanese RPGs had a lot in common with anime and manga tropes. But in this one, when you look really closely at Dagger or Garnet, her story, and if you compare that to the monomyth, her story eclipses very, very well with the monomyth. And if you're not familiar with the monomyth, this is a storytelling kind of template, also called the hero's journey. And pretty much any story that has a hero going on a journey fits into the monomyth. Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, it all falls into that monomyth. And here, Garnet goes through every step of that. There is a call to action, there's a crossing of a barrier, and then there is a boon at the end where you receive your heart's desire after fulfilling your quest. There's a spiritual guide who assists her on her journey in Steiner. There is a sacrifice that has to be made. There is a trial that has to be overcome, where she has to face off against her own mother as a villain. So she completely goes through the hero's journey.
Absolutely.
I don't feel like Zidane does that. No,
and I thinking about the times that I've played Final Fantasy IX, and I think about Zidane as a character, it makes me think that the story in and of itself, yes, you're introduced to Zidane first, but it's like you're introduced to the supporting cast before the lead comes around.
That's true, and it's so hard to not think back to the beginning of the game. And when you start the game, you're not playing as Zidane, you're playing as Vivi, and Vivi is amazing. Like, how do you not love Vivi right away as soon as you start playing the game? He's so innocent, and he just kind of appears, right? And I don't think in the beginning of the game even Vivi really knows about where he came from, and he doesn't really even seem to think about it or question it until later in the game.
Yeah,
but
he just kind of, the opening scene, you're in Alexandria and you're going to see a
Mm-hmm.
play. And you
Yeah.
start off as Vivi, and you're just there. You're in Alexandria. And it always made me wonder because, he talks a lot about his grandpa and things like that. What drove him? What was the motivation to go to Alexandria? It couldn't have just been, oh, there's a play that I want to go see, so I got to go to Alexandria. You know what I mean? What
Yeah.
what was he searching? I've always asked myself that question. Was it that he was searching for who he truly was, and when he got to Alexandria, he realized, oh, there's a play. It's time to relax a little bit from my adventures so far, and go see this show.
There's so much to talk about with Vivi because his entire character arc is a quest for identity. He's trying to find himself. He's trying to figure out who he is. And for him, it's a lot more transparent than the rest of the cast. But everybody in the cast is doing the same thing. They're all trying to find out who they are. They're all having a little bit of an identity crisis. I mean, I talked before about how, like in Final Fantasy VII remake, that Jassie's only personality trait is that she's horny. Zidane's kind of the same thing. The difference being Zidane's a teenage boy, and you expect that to a degree. But as the story progresses, you find that Zidane is so incredibly good. Like, he has goodness so deeply etched into the core of his heart that even when his own brother tries to kill him for the entire game, and he has the opportunity to leave Kuja to die, he absolutely will not do it because he just is too good. To him, Kuja being his brother is way more important than Kuja trying to kill him.
And
I mean, Dagger's entire arc is about breaking away from the chains of the responsibilities that she has as a princess and trying to find a life free of that. And again, going back to the hero's journey, for her, it becomes eventually the acceptance of that responsibility and her own freedom and her mastery of two worlds. So that's a huge theme in this game.
absolutely, absolutely. And I know how you brought up that it was. Did you say Katase's favorite game?
Sakaguchi's
Sakaguchi's
favorite.
favorite.
The father of the franchise, the father of the series.
Uematsu also has said that 9 was his musical masterpiece. So there's that as well. And I thought that was actually really cool because when you think about it, Melodies of Life is probably one
Mm-hmm.
of my favorite world map themes in an RPG. It's something special.
There's a lot of throwbacks in here too, and the soundtrack reminds me of that because like when you go into the volcano, you have the very similar music to FF1, and a lot of sequences are like that. It just reminds me of how many throwbacks there are. And a couple of things that I really loved about this game when it came out, because this one was not really that well received. This one was kind of like I think this one even was less well received than 8, if I remember correctly. It was also released, like the PS2 I think was already out by the time this game came out, but that's a whole other conversation. Uh, so this game has so many throwbacks, and I loved how they brought the crystal motif back. So there's crystals again, and that becomes more of an important idea. And you have character classes, jobs again, which you didn't really have in 7 and 8. And finally, you have 4 characters in the group at a time again, where 7 and 8 you only had 3, and I always felt like that was so lopsided because you didn't really have your normal build out that you would expect to have, where you would have your kind of damage sponge person, and then you would have somebody who does a lot of physical attack damage, somebody who does a lot of magic attack damage, and then somebody who protects and heals the party. Now you finally have that back in this game. And that was fantastic for me because I missed that so much with 7 and 8. It was a very welcome change to kind of go back to that older sort of formula.
You know what I was going to ask you, I'm sure our listeners would be interested in hearing this as well. Myself, with Final Fantasy IX, I have never quite figured out Amaranth, Amaranth, Armornath. I can't remember.
Amaranth.
Amaranth. Yeah, I can't figure out his story, his motivation. Why he was hired to kill, and was it that he just respects strength and he chose a side that he thought was the stronger side? I don't. He's just kind of appears and then he's like, "Oh, I'll join you."
Yeah, he wasn't. Yeah, he wasn't written well. I could say a lot of great things about this game, but and a lot of people don't like the character of Amaranth, and I don't blame them because he wasn't written very well. I think what it really comes down to for him is, yes, he admires strength, and that's the reason why he first decides to go as Zidane. But I think it's something more than that, right? Because for Amaranth, he had to have some other reason why he felt Zidane was special, right? And because Zidane is this hero who has so much goodness, and I think that Amaranth was attracted to that goodness. And there were some later on some of the active time events, some of the ATEs.
Right.
There's one where I think it's Garnet talking to Amaranth about, why are you here? Like why? And they're talking about Zidane and why they chose to follow him. So maybe it wasn't Garnet, it would have been somebody else. But they were talking about why they chose to follow him. It was Freya, rather. Freya. Fran's the bunny from 12. Freya and Amaranth talking about why they chose to follow Zidane. And basically their reasoning kind of boils down to the same thing. Amaranth started following him because he was just impressed by how unexpectedly strong Zidane was. He was able to beat him in a fight, which he didn't think by looking at him would be possible. But on top of that, everything he's seen Zidane do since that time has inspired him to be a better person.
And wasn't there a scene, ATE in, I can't think of the town name, but at the auction house where he was trying to make amends for his past.
Yeah. By that time in the game, I'm drawing a blank too. It was a while since I last played it, but he definitely was inspired by Zidane to do better and to be better. So in the beginning, I think it was almost more of a if you can't beat him, join him sort of a scenario, or maybe he was concerned that the people who hired him would kill him if he didn't get the job done, so he may as well join up with Zidane. That would be a better explanation. But as the story progresses, it's because he is becoming a better person because of his association with somebody who is so ridiculously good that he's an inspiration to the people that travel.
And
and there's
go ahead.
It's hard to get into every single character arc but they're all so great. I know Steiner is another character that I think is not as well loved as he deserves to be. Because Steiner starts the game out with like these blinders on, and all he cares about is like his duty, and he's kind of like a satire. He is a parody of a knight or a samurai. Somebody who is super, because it is a Japanese game after all. He is somebody who is so duty bound and so concerned about his value being directly associated to his ability to perform his duty, that he's completely blind to the moral or ethical ramifications of the things he chooses to do or not do. And his whole character arc is him coming to terms with the fact that your duty is not always the right thing to do. Sometimes the right thing to do means breaking a rule or not doing what you're told.
Right. And I was going to say, because we're talking about the characters here, one of the most memorable characters or set of characters in this title are the Black Waltz. I just loved how they were as characters. Black Waltz, man, they were so fun to fight. They were so fun as characters. Just it was great. It was great. It was one of those. I just wanted to bring up Black Waltz and the Black Waltz 1, 2, and 3, and just the airship chase. Oh, there's so much you could say about this game.
I love the imagination of taking that original design of the Black Mage from the original Final Fantasy and building all this lore around that appearance. Because it really was a bizarre appearance in the original Final Fantasy that the Black Mage had like no face, just eyes peeking out of the darkness. And there was no lore behind it, it just kind of was. It was cool seeing that built up into something much bigger than what it was. And that's kind of, I guess that's kind of a good segue into what I feel is the most important element of this game is the fairy tale feel of the game. And that's what they were going for when they created it. They wanted a fairy tale feel. And like the last time I played this was maybe like, I want to say like 2 years ago, a year or two ago. I played it and it had been long enough since the last time I experienced the game that I was able to be captivated by the magic of this game all over again. This game world is really magical. And once you start the game, when you're in Alexandria for the first time, it's inescapable. That feeling of wonder and magic, it really is like a fairy tale. It's so wonderful. It's such a wonderful game world.
It is.
I absolutely I absolutely fell in love with it all over again. It's just the fantasy medieval setting, the princesses and magic, and the way it's all presented. It's so hard for me to put it into words right now. It's a wonderful experience to be in this game.
And I love
it's a beautiful
I
place.
love the callbacks to Final Fantasy I, where they have the 4 super bosses that were also like the Lich, the Kraken,
the Fiends.
Yeah.
Release the Kraken. Oh, did you know that this game was inspired by the movie The Dark Crystal?
That is the first time I've heard that.
Yeah, it's a cool little factoid. That was one of the things that inspired and influenced this game was the movie The Dark Crystal, which I didn't actually watch until I was already an adult. Yeah, so that's kind of a cool little piece of trivia.
That was the same thing with me in Labyrinth.
Yeah. Sakaguchi said he wanted to make... Sorry to interrupt there. I'll let you finish that thought. I'm going to let you finish. But the goal... Sakaguchi said the goal of the game was to make a world that a child might dream up.
Yeah.
And that's just such a beautiful thought and such a wonderful idea. And I think about it because, I have my son, he's almost 6. And I think about it, I'm like, yeah, this sort of is the kind of thing that a little kid, if you give him some time and say, hey, let's create something. Okay, well, where's our story taking place? How about a castle? Okay, and who's there? Well, there's a man, and he has a tail. It seems like something a little kid would come up with.
Absolutely.
Now you were saying about Labyrinth.
Yes, I watched that as an adult. I just didn't. I wasn't too aware of it when I was younger, and so that was one of those films that I didn't see until I was an adult. And a lot of people put Labyrinth and Dark Crystal kind of in the same category. So I just,
yeah.
But yes, it was the world of.
You remind me of the babe.
The world of Final Fantasy.
The babe with the power.
The world of Final Fantasy IX. From the mist to the airships to the village of mages to the chocobos. And let's... one of the things about Final Fantasy IX that I did because I wanted to, it was one of the biggest side quests in the game. It was the chocobo treasure hunt. Man, yes. I tell you, that one, I must have spent hours upon hours upon hours digging to find those treasure charts or treasure stones or whatever it might be.
Right.
And in the end, it was worth it because I got a chance to fight Uzma.
So I didn't really bother with that when I originally played the game. I didn't really bother with it. When I played it a couple of years back, I was playing it on Steam, which is like a port of the mobile version, but like there's mods to make it more like the original. But I played it on Steam, and it has a fast forward feature, which was very useful for the Chocobo Hot and Cold.
The only issue, because I have it on Xbox, I have it on my Xbox, and the only issue I ran into with that fast forward button was that your timer runs just as fast as everything else does.
Mm-hmm.
So it helps to a point.
All right. It just helped me move around faster and
Yeah,
find treasures
and it
faster.
did that so with myself, but trying to find the yeah, man. Oh, that was a pain in the butt, but it was so worth it because you got to the sky and you could fight Uzma and you got Zidane's ultimate weapon, and it was fun. It was fun.
Yeah, I never beat Ozma because to make Ozma beatable, you have to finish the creature's side quest, which is not finishable on my save file because somehow some kind of glitch occurred where one of the creatures just never spawns.
Nice. That's gonna be fun. Yeah, because he's...
Like, I tried for hours upon hours upon hours to get that last creature to spawn, and it just wouldn't happen. And I went back to every location, and I made a checklist, and I checked off every one to make sure I got them all, and the last one just would not ever show up. So some kind of bug or glitch or broken thing.
I ended up getting all of Quina's blue magic spells. That was one of the side quests that I did. Completed the frog catching side quest. Did that.
That's another tedious one. Actually, that wasn't too bad.
Although if you leave one male and one female frog and don't catch them all, then they respawn at a faster rate.
Yes, that's right. Yes, that is true. Yeah, and the Tetramaster game, was the other big mini game in there, and that one was fun, but it's not as good as
No, and I struggled actually.
Optional though.
I struggled with learning Final Fantasy IX's card game, Tetramaster. I couldn't.
I got pretty good at it.
I couldn't really figure out how the damage worked, or how obviously it's what cards you have in your deck and how you play them. Same thing with
it's the arrows.
Same thing with Triple Triad, but I found Triple Triad so much easier to understand because they had the numbers in the top corner, or they had the 4 numbers, and then all you had to do was have a higher number than your opponent.
Yeah, Tetramaster was kind of almost like, I feel like Triple Triad was a little bit more like a Magic the Gathering, or even like D&D with cards kind of a situation where you had stats you had to worry about, and damage and defense, in a manner of speaking. Whereas Tetramaster was almost more like chess. Like, you didn't really have attack and defense values so much. There was no, this card is worth more than this other card. It was really just all about placement and having some idea of what to expect. So, you would obviously try your very best to keep your sides of your card that don't have an arrow pointed toward the border or pointed toward another card that's already been played. And then try to anticipate what the opponent has or doesn't have in their deck. Which is, obviously very hard to do, but if you've played it a few times, you'll kind of learn who has what cards, and then have an understanding of where it's safe and smart to play your cards.
Exactly. So... there is so much that we have yet to cover in this series that we could cover, but realistically speaking, you folks, if you're a fan of Final Fantasy, you know exactly these games are special. These 3 games, yeah, we could be here all night talking about.
We could go there are so many things that I wrote down that I wanted to talk about that we haven't
Absolutely.
even touched.
And that's what makes it tough sometimes, because you want to present, the best possible for you folks, and then you just kind of get on a line and you keep going, and then next thing you know, it's like, oh. So, little insight into the show there. But, yeah, so stay tuned for us, or with us, for next episode, which is going to be Final Fantasy X and beyond, and how much wine Titus has. But anyway, I wanted to wrap things up, and I wanted to just kind of talk real briefly about the weather forecast. Now you're asking yourself, what are you talking about? Well, we're talking about Final Fantasy. We're talking about cloud. We're talking about squall. Talking about... Listen, that's one of the things that Final Fantasy has done, especially with the newer games, that I think there's even a rain in there. There's a lightning. I mean, it has always, for some reason, they have decided to make their characters based upon a weather phenomenon, and it was one of those small little trivia facts that I just found interesting. So
are you saying there's like a 40% chance of Zidane, because rumors abound of a Final Fantasy IX remake?
You know,
and if they butcher that, and here's another thing I'm gonna get beat up for. If they butcher that the way they butchered 7, I know people are gonna come after me for this, but I'm sorry, man. I played Final Fantasy VII remake, and I couldn't get past like the honeybee part. I don't like it. I don't like the game. I don't like it. So if they did to 9 what they did to 7, I am not gonna like it.
I think more than anything, and the rumors that I've seen floating around about it, it's more that they're going to sharpen the graphics and make them more modern looking. They're not really going to change the story or the characters. Basically, what they're going to do is retouch the artwork and make it like a mod. I think there's a mod out there right now that essentially makes Final Fantasy IX look like it was developed in like 2015, 2016, something like that.
That's how I played it. Yeah, I played with the Moguri mod.
Absolutely gorgeous, and I think that's what Square is intending on doing with it.
Okay, that's okay. As long as they don't make like a supporting character and turn her into like a walking pile of horny, then
well, yeah, and okay. I mean, the only thing,
and don't add like don't add like a teenage schoolyard rival for the protagonist to fight for no reason. Also don't do that.
Yeah, I hear you there.
And don't turn Tantalus into like a worldwide organization with chapters all over the planet, and all the other bad things they did. They did a lot of bad things.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only...
Look what they did to my boy. They massacred my boy.
With 9 though, I think the one thing that I like is just a brief, and I'm not talking about hours upon hours upon hours of gameplay, but a brief section that really defines Amaranth better than what they initially did. I think that he deserves it, because as a character, I really liked using him because of his claws. He's a fighter, and he was such a benefit to the party.
His special ability kind of sucks. I think he had a couple of really good ones. His hair, by the way, is modeled after a plant called the amaranth, the amaranth coral, or the coral amaranth. That's why he's called Amaranth. He looks like a coral amaranth.
Yeah, I saw that. That was actually really cool.
And Blank from Tantalus is... I have a whole thing about Blank, too, from Tantalus. If y'all notice that he has stitches all over him. So I'm not going to do the whole thing. It's a whole thing. But if you Google Tantalus and look up the myth that has to do with Tantalus, and look at Blank, and then you guys will be able to figure it out. I don't want to sit there and talk about that. It's already an hour and a half, and we're going to wind up with a 2-hour show of me talking about, references to Greek mythology and Final Fantasy, and that's a college lecture. You got to pay to be bored. You got to pay me if you want me to bore you that much.
Pay me and I'll talk. Yeah. Little Zelda reference going back to the beginning there.
I don't get really boring unless I'm getting a check.
That's true. So anyway,
you want literary analysis of the Final Fantasy games? Write me a check.
And I want to thank you for joining us today on the Console Kingdom podcast and our Final Fantasy retrospective. It was a good time. It was a lot of fun. And I'm so excited for the next episode, so stay tuned for that. You can find us on Facebook.com/The Console Kingdom, Twitter.com/TCKPodcast01, on our Discord at The Console Kingdom Podcast, and on YouTube at The Console Kingdom. Anyway, love you guys. Have a great one. And game on, my friends. Game